My name is Sarah Catherine Brooks. I am 47 years old. I am the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. But to my family, none of that ever mattered. To them, I was the stubborn daughter who asked too many questions, the one who didn't know when to stay quiet, the embarrassment who thought she was smarter than everyone else. I was the one they publicly humiliated, the one they had security remove from my own cousin's murder trial. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss, because in their eyes I was nothing more than a troublemaker who brought shame to the Brooks family name. I still remember the cold marble floor of the federal courthouse that morning as the bailiff's hands gripped my arms, escorting me past the mahogany benches where my own blood sat in silence. My family, the very people who raised me, had me thrown out like a common disruption. I wasn't allowed to stay. I wasn't wanted. I stood in the hallway outside Judge Morrison's courtroom, watching through the small rectangular window as they sat in their tailored suits, whispering behind manicured hands. I wasn't permitted to support my cousin. I wasn't allowed to seek justice, all because I had questioned their strategy. At least that's what they told themselves. They had no idea who I really was, no idea what I had accomplished, no idea what was about to walk through those courthouse doors. But let me take you back to where it all began, because the seeds of that humiliation were planted long before I ever set foot in that courtroom. I grew up in Millbrook, Connecticut, in a house that looked perfect from the outside, white colonial with black shutters, manicured lawn, circular driveway where my father's Mercedes and my mother's BMW sat like twin symbols of everything the Brooks family represented. Success, status, control. My parents, Richard and Patricia Brooks, were what you might call legal royalty in our small corner of New England. My father was a senior partner at Brooks, Hamilton and Associates, the law firm his grandfather had founded in 19. My mother had been a federal prosecutor before she married into the family name, and decided that managing my father's career and our family's reputation was a full-time job in itself. They had very specific ideas about what success looked like, what respectability meant, and exactly how their children should fit into the carefully constructed world they had built for themselves. My older brother, Michael, was the golden child, tall, handsome, charming in that effortless way that opened doors before he even had to knock. He sailed through Harvard Law, joined the family firm straight out of school, and married Rebecca Whitman, whose father happened to be a federal judge. Every family photograph showed Michael's perfect smile, his perfect wife, their perfect life unfolding exactly as my parents had scripted it. Then there was me. From my earliest memories, I was the question mark in their perfectly ordered equation. Where Michael was smooth, I was sharp. When he charmed, I challenged. Where he accepted, I analyzed. I was the child who asked why when everyone else simply nodded along. I remember being 7 years old, sitting at our formal dining table while my parents discussed one of my father's cases. They were talking about a client who had been accused of embezzling funds from a children's charity. My father was explaining his strategy to get the charges reduced, talking about technicalities and procedural loopholes. But if he stole money from children, I interrupted, my small voice cutting through their adult conversation, shouldn't he go to jail? The table went silent. My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. My father's eyebrows drew together in that way that meant I had said something wrong, something that didn't belong in polite conversation. Sarah, my mother said softly, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for children who had spoken out of turn. We don't talk about Daddy's work that way. Some things are more complicated than they seem. But stealing is wrong, I insisted, my 7-year-old logic unable to understand why complexity mattered more than right and wrong. You taught me that stealing is wrong. My father set down his wine glass with more force than necessary. Sarah Catherine Brooks, he said, using my full name the way he did when his patience was wearing thin. When you understand law the way I do, then you can have opinions about it. Until then, children should listen more than they say. I didn't understand then that I had committed a cardinal sin in the Brooks household. I had questioned authority. I had suggested that maybe, just maybe, the system my father navigated so skillfully might sometimes be wrong. That dinner table became a metaphor for my entire childhood. I was always the one asking the uncomfortable questions, always the one pointing out inconsistencies that everyone else seemed content to ignore. While Michael learned to nod appreciatively at my father's legal strategies, I couldn't help but notice when those strategies seemed designed more to help wealthy clients escape consequences than to serve any meaningful sense of justice. When I was 12, my parents took us to a charity gala where my father was being honored for his contributions to the legal community. I watched him accept an award for pro bono work while knowing that his actual pro bono hours barely met the Bar Association's minimum requirement. I saw him shake hands with judges and prosecutors, the same people he regularly criticized in private for being too soft or politically motivated. "Why do you pretend to like them?" I asked him during the car ride home. My father responded, adjusting his rearview mirror to look at me. "Sarah, this is called being professional. It's called understanding how the world works. But you said Judge Martinez was an idiot just last week." The car fell silent, except for the hum of the engine. My mother turned around in her seat, her diamond earrings catching the light from passing street lamps. "Sarah," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "there are things you say in private, and things you say in public. Learning the difference is part of growing up." "So you mean law?" "I mean diplomacy," my father cut in, his knuckles whitening as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I mean understanding that the world isn't as simple as your little moral absolutes. I mean learning when to keep your mouth shut." That night, lying in my canopy bed, surrounded by the symbols of privilege my parents had worked so hard to provide, I realized that my family operated by rules I didn't understand and wasn't sure I wanted to learn. They seemed to believe that being right mattered less than being successful, that integrity was negotiable as long as the negotiation was handled diplomatically. The older I got, the wider the gap became between what I believed and what my family expected. In high school, when other students were cheating on exams or getting their parents to donate their way into better grades, I couldn't bring myself to participate. When my parents suggested I could network my way into an internship at my father's firm, I insisted on applying to public defenders' offices instead. "Why would you want to work with criminals?" my mother asked, genuine confusion coloring her voice as she stood in my bedroom doorway, watching me fill out application after application. "They're not criminals," I replied without looking up from my desk. "They're people who can't afford lawyers. There's a Sarah," she sighed, sitting down on the edge of my bed, "I don't understand why you want to make everything so much harder than it has to be. Your father could arrange something wonderful for you. You could learn from the best lawyers in the state." "I want to learn how to help people who actually need help." "We help people," she said, and for the first time I heard something defensive in her voice. "Your father helps very important people with very complex problems." I finally turned around in my chair to face her. "Mom, when was the last time Dad helped someone who couldn't pay his hourly rate?" She was quiet for a long moment, her hands smoothing the fabric of my comforter in small repetitive motions. "You don't understand how the world works yet," she said finally. "You think everything is black and white, good and bad, but real life is more complicated than that." "Maybe," I said, turning back to my applications, "but that doesn't mean we stop trying to tell the difference." While Michael spent his college break working at my father's firm and attending networking events, I worked at the Hartford Public Defender's Office, making $12 an hour and learning more about justice in 3 months than I had in 18 years of my parents' lectures about how the world worked. I met clients who had been arrested for sleeping in parks because they had nowhere else to go. I saw teenagers charged with felonies for stealing food because they were hungry. I watched overworked attorneys trying to provide adequate representation to dozens of clients with impossible caseloads and insufficient resources. And I also saw something else. I saw lawyers who went home every night, knowing they had fought for people who had no one else to fight for them. I saw advocates who measured success not in billable hours or partnership tracks, but in lives changed, families kept together, futures preserved. When I came home that fall, excited to share what I had learned, my parents listened with the kind of polite attention reserved for children's hobbies they hoped would pass with time. "It sounds like you had a meaningful experience," my father said over dinner, cutting his steak with precise economical movements. Those kinds of programs are good for perspective. They help you understand why the rule of law matters, why strong legal institutions are essential for society to function. It helped me understand that strong legal institutions don't mean much if only rich people can access them, I replied. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual. Michael cleared his throat and began talking about his classes at Harvard, smoothly redirecting the conversation away from my uncomfortable observations. But I had tasted something that summer that I couldn't forget. I had seen what the law could be when it served justice instead of just serving success. And despite my family's expectations, despite the path they had carefully mapped out for me, I knew I couldn't go back to pretending their version of the legal world was the only one that mattered. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The foundation was already cracking, though none of us understood yet how completely it would eventually crumble. All I knew was that every family dinner, every conversation about my future, every well-meaning piece of advice felt like another step away from the people who were supposed to know me best. They looked at me and saw a daughter who didn't appreciate her advantages. I looked at them and saw people who had forgotten that advantages come with responsibilities. The distance between those two perspectives would only grow wider with time, until we were standing on opposite sides of a courtroom, unable to recognize each other at all. College was supposed to be my escape, but somehow the expectations followed me to New Haven. Yale Law School had been my father's alma mater, and despite my desire to forge my own path, I couldn't deny the opportunities it would provide. What I didn't anticipate was how thoroughly my family's influence would extend even there. During my first semester, Professor Davidson assigned us to write a brief analyzing a landmark civil rights case. I chose to examine the systemic failures that had allowed discriminatory housing practices to persist despite federal legislation. It was thorough, well-researched, and passionate in a way that felt authentic to everything I believed about justice. When I received my grade, there was a note clipped to the paper. "See me after class." Professor Davidson's office smelled like old leather and pipe tobacco. Books lined every available surface, and the late afternoon light filtered through windows that probably hadn't been cleaned since the Carter administration. "Miss Brooks," he began, settling behind his massive oak desk, "your brief was technically sound. Your research was comprehensive. But I waited, my stomach beginning to knot. "I had lunch with your father last week. He mentioned you've been going through a bit of a rebellious phase, questioning established practices, getting swept up in idealistic causes." The blood rushed to my face. "My father discussed my academic work with you? He's concerned about your trajectory." "As am I." Professor Davidson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Yale Law produces leaders. Miss Brooks. Leaders understand that change happens gradually, through established channels. They don't tear down systems, they work within them. What if the systems are broken? Nothing is broken that can't be reformed through proper legal channels. Your brief reads like an activist manifesto rather than a legal analysis. That's not going to serve you well here, or in your career." I stared at him, understanding with crystalline clarity that this wasn't really about my writing. This was about my father's phone call, about his embarrassment over his daughter's phase, about the subtle but unmistakable pressure to conform to expectations I had never agreed to meet. "I see," I said quietly. "I hope you do. You have tremendous potential, Miss Brooks. Don't waste it on crusades that will only limit your opportunities." I rewrote the brief, made it less passionate, more balanced, more focused on technical legal precedents than on the human cost of institutional failures. I received an A- and felt like I had sold something I couldn't quite name. The pattern repeated itself throughout law school. When I wrote about criminal justice reform, professors suggested I focus on practical improvements rather than systemic overhauls. When I expressed interest in constitutional law, my academic advisors steered me toward corporate law courses that would provide better career foundations. When I mentioned wanting to clerk for judges known for their progressive interpretations of civil rights law, Suddenly, those positions were highly competitive and probably not realistic for someone with my particular background. My particular background, as if coming from privilege disqualified me from caring about justice. The worst part wasn't the direct confrontations, it was the subtle erosion. The way my confidence began to waver under the constant suggestion that my instincts were naive, my passions misguided, my goals impractical. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe they were right. If maybe I was just an idealistic young woman who didn't understand how the world really worked. During my second year, I was selected for a prestigious internship with a federal appeals court. Judge Patricia Hernandez was known for her brilliant legal mind and her commitment to equal justice under law. I was thrilled, finally feeling like I was moving toward something that aligned with my values. The phone call came 2 days before I was supposed to start. "Sarah, sweetheart." My mother's voice was bright with false cheer. "I have wonderful news. Your father spoke with Judge Morrison. You remember Judge Morrison? He and Daddy play golf together, and he has an opening in his chambers this summer." "Isn't that exciting?" "Mom, I already have an internship with Judge Hernandez." "Oh, that." "Well, Daddy explained the situation to her chambers, and they were very understanding about releasing you. Judge Morrison's position is much more prestigious, and frankly more appropriate." The room seemed to tilt around me. "You canceled my internship? We secured you a better opportunity." Judge Morrison handles high-profile commercial litigation, the kind of experience that will actually serve your career. "You had no right." "Sarah Catherine Brooks." My father's voice cut through the phone as he picked up the extension. "We are your parents. We have every right to guide your career decisions, especially when you're making choices that could limit your future prospects." Judge Hernandez is a respected federal judge. Judge Hernandez is a liberal activist who thinks the courts should solve every social problem in America. Judge Morrison understands that the law should be applied, not rewritten from the bench. I spent that summer researching commercial disputes and antitrust cases, learning about corporate mergers and securities regulations. The work was intellectually challenging, but it felt hollow, disconnected from any sense of purpose or meaning. Judge Morrison was undeniably brilliant, but his brilliance was focused on protecting the interests of powerful corporations rather than individual rights or constitutional principles. When I tried to engage him in conversations about broader questions of justice or judicial philosophy, he would smile indulgently and suggest that such discussions were academic luxuries that practicing lawyers couldn't afford. "Your father tells me you're interested in constitutional law," he said one afternoon, as I was organizing case files in his chambers. "That's admirable, but constitutional law doesn't pay the bills. Corporate law, securities law, tax law, that's where the real intellectual challenges lie. That's where you can build a practice that matters." I thought constitutional law was what mattered most, the foundation of everything else. Judge Morrison laughed, not unkindly. "Miss Brooks, constitutional law is mostly settled. The interesting questions now are in the areas where the law is still developing, still growing. Commercial law, international trade, intellectual property. That's where young lawyers can make real contributions." I nodded and said nothing, but inside I was screaming. Constitutional law wasn't settled, civil rights weren't settled, equal protection wasn't settled. The questions that kept me awake at night, the cases that made my heart race with the possibility of real change, those weren't academic luxuries. They were the beating heart of what law was supposed to be. But no one in my family's circle seemed to see it that way. To them, the law was a profession, not a calling. Success was measured in billable hours and partnership tracks, not in lives changed or justice served. My third year of law school brought the law review selection process. My grades were excellent, my writing samples strong, but somehow the politics of selection felt familiar in the worst possible way. During my interview with the editorial board, I was asked about my career goals. "I'm interested in civil rights litigation," I answered honestly. "Constitutional law, specifically equal protection and due process issues." The student editor, a third year whose father was a senior partner at a white shoe firm in Manhattan, exchanged glances with the faculty advisor. "That's Admirable, she said carefully. But law review members need to demonstrate serious academic commitment. Civil rights work, while socially valuable, doesn't always provide the kind of rigorous legal analysis that our publication requires. I think constitutional interpretation requires the most rigorous analysis of all, I replied. The cases that define fundamental rights seem like exactly the kind of scholarship law review should showcase. Of course, the faculty advisor interjected smoothly, but we also need to consider practical applications. Our readers are primarily practicing attorneys and judges who deal with commercial and regulatory issues. Constitutional theory, while interesting, has limited practical application for most legal professionals. I didn't make law review. The letter cited competitive applicant pool and difficult selection decisions, but I knew the truth. My interests didn't align with their vision of serious legal scholarship. My passion for justice was seen as a disqualifying characteristic rather than a fundamental qualification. The message was clear, repeated so often and in so many ways that I had begun to internalize it. Sarah Brooks was too idealistic, too naive, too focused on abstract principles rather than practical realities. I was a disappointment to my family, a puzzle to my professors, a young woman who didn't understand how the legal world really operated. By graduation, I had learned to keep my real thoughts to myself. I had learned to write briefs that said what was expected rather than what I believed. I had learned to nod appreciatively when judges spoke about the importance of legal stability and predictability, even when that stability meant preserving injustices that could be remedied if anyone had the courage to try. I had learned, in other words, to be the kind of lawyer my family wanted me to be. Successful, respectable, and safely disconnected from any cause that might prove inconvenient or controversial. But late at night, in the privacy of my small apartment, I still read constitutional law cases, with the same sense of wonder and possibility I had felt as a child, asking uncomfortable questions at the dinner table. I still believed that the law could be more than just a tool for the powerful to maintain their power. I still dreamed of a courtroom where justice meant more than just technical legal victory. I just hadn't figured out how to bridge the gap between those dreams and the reality my family had constructed around me. That bridge would come later, though not in any way I could have imagined. And when it finally appeared, it would change everything. 5 years into my career at Morrison, Hartwell and Associates, the prestigious firm where my family had secured me a position straight out of law school, I thought I had found my rhythm. I handled corporate mergers, securities compliance, and regulatory matters with competence that earned me respect from partners and steady advancement toward what everyone assumed was my inevitable goal: partnership in the family business. The work paid well, the hours were manageable by big law standards, and my parents finally seemed proud of the professional trajectory I was following. I had learned to find satisfaction in the intellectual puzzles of commercial law, even if they didn't ignite the passion I once felt for constitutional questions. But everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when my cousin Danny called me, his voice shaking in a way I had never heard before. "Sarah, I need help. Real help. They arrested Jessica. Jessica Morrison, no relation to Judge Morrison, was Danny's girlfriend of 3 years, a social worker who ran after-school programs in Hartford's poorest neighborhoods. She was one of the most genuinely good people I had ever met. Someone who believed in second chances and spent her own money buying supplies for kids whose families couldn't afford them." "Arrested for what?" I asked, already reaching for a legal pad. "Murder. They're saying she killed Marcus Webb, one of the kids from her program." "Sarah, it's impossible. Jessica loved that kid. She was trying to help him get into college. Marcus Webb." I remembered the name from news reports. 17 years old, found shot in an abandoned building in the North End. The kind of story that made headlines for a day before disappearing into the statistics of urban violence. "Danny, slow down. Tell me exactly what happened." Over the next hour, I learned that Jessica had been arrested based on a single witness, a man named Tommy Vasquez, who claimed he saw her near the building the night Marcus was killed. The physical evidence was thin: Jessica's fingerprints on a door handle, which made sense since she had visited the building earlier that week as part of her outreach work. No weapon, no motive, no forensic evidence connecting her to the actual shooting. It doesn't make sense, Danny kept repeating. The cops aren't even looking for anyone else. They just want to close the case. I spent the rest of that day researching Jessica's situation, calling contacts in the public defender's office, trying to understand how such a flimsy case could result in murder charges. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Jessica had been assigned to Malcolm Chen, an overworked public defender carrying more than 60 active cases. He was competent but overwhelmed, and the preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. He had barely had time to review the police reports, let alone investigate alternative suspects or challenge the reliability of the witness testimony. "Look," Malcolm told me during a phone call that evening, "I'll do my best, but this isn't going to be a long trial. The witness is credible, at least on paper. She was in the area. The prosecutor is pushing for a plea deal, manslaughter instead of murder 15 to 20 instead of life without parole. She didn't do it, maybe not. But proving that with limited resources and unlimited caseload is another matter entirely. Do you want my advice? Tell her to take the deal. 15 years is better than life." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jessica, probably lying awake in a jail cell, facing decades in prison for a crime she didn't commit. I thought about Marcus Webb, whose real killer was walking free while the system rushed toward the easiest resolution rather than the right one. And I thought about something else. For the first time in 5 years, I felt that old fire in my chest, the sense of purpose that had been gradually suffocated by regulatory compliance and merger documents. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I requested a meeting with Harrison Morrison, the senior partner who had been my mentor since joining the firm. His corner office overlooked Hartford's skyline, and the walls were lined with photographs of him shaking hands with governors, senators, and Supreme Court justices. "Sarah," he said warmly, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk, "what can I do for you? I need to request a leave of absence." "Personal matter." His expression shifted slightly, the warmth replaced by professional concern. "Nothing serious, I hope. My cousin's girlfriend has been charged with murder. I want to assist with her defense." The silence that followed felt like ice forming on a window. Harrison set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Sarah, I'm sure that's very distressing for your family, but we have excellent relationships with several criminal defense attorneys who could. I want to handle it myself. You're a corporate attorney. You've never tried a criminal case." "I've never tried this kind of criminal case. But I understand constitutional law, I understand evidence, and I understand when an innocent person is being railroaded by a system that values convenience over justice." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for hostile witnesses. "Sarah, we've invested considerable time and resources in your development here. You're on track for partnership consideration next year. Taking time off to play public defender could seriously impact your career trajectory. This isn't about playing anything. This is about someone who needs help. There are public defenders whose job it is to provide that help. The public defender has 60 other cases, and 2 weeks to prepare for trial. Would that be adequate representation for someone you cared about?" Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sarah, I think you're letting emotion cloud your professional judgment. This is exactly the kind of idealistic crusading that your father and I discussed when you joined the firm. We hoped you had moved past that phase." The words hit me like a physical blow. "My father discussed my idealistic crusading with you. We're concerned about your long-term prospects. Corporate law requires clear thinking, practical solutions, and strategic planning. Getting involved in hopeless criminal cases suggests you still haven't grasped the realities of legal practice." I stared at him, understanding with perfect clarity that this conversation had been predetermined. My father had called ahead, just like he had with Professor Davidson years earlier. The script was already written. Sarah's inappropriate emotional involvement, Sarah's failure to understand practical realities, Sarah's need for guidance from wiser, more experienced men. "What if she's innocent?" I asked quietly. "What if she's guilty?" Harrison countered. What if you destroy your career defending someone who committed murder? What if you throw away partnership at one of the most prestigious firms in New England because you can't distinguish between personal feelings and professional responsibilities? And what if I don't, and she spends the rest of her life in prison for something she didn't do? Harrison stood up, walking to the window with his hands clasped behind his back. Sarah, your family has been part of this firm for 3 generations. Your father built much of what we are today. Don't force us to choose between our loyalty to him and our concerns about your judgment. The threat was delivered so smoothly, so professionally, that it took a moment to sink in, but there it was. Fall in line, or face the consequences. I stood up as well, my legs steadier than I had expected. I'm not forcing you to choose anything, I said. I'm making a choice myself. Think carefully about what you're doing. I am. For the first time in 5 years, I'm thinking very carefully about what I'm doing. That afternoon, I submitted my resignation letter. Not a leave of absence, not a sabbatical, but a complete severance from the career path my family had spent decades constructing for me. The phone calls started within hours. First my mother, then my father, then Michael, all of them using different words to express the same basic message. I was making a terrible mistake, throwing away everything they had worked to build, embarrassing the family name for the sake of someone who probably deserved whatever consequences she was facing. You don't understand what you're giving up, my father said during our final conversation that week. You'll never get another opportunity like this. Firms like Morris & Hartwell don't take back attorneys who abandon their responsibilities for personal crusades. Maybe I don't want to come back. You're not thinking clearly. This girl has you emotionally compromised. You're making decisions based on feelings instead of facts. The fact is that an innocent person is about to be convicted of murder because she can't afford adequate representation. The fact is that I have the skills to help her, and the resources to do it properly. The fact is that for the first time since law school, I remember why I wanted to become an attorney in the first place. Sarah, Dad, I love you. But I can't be the lawyer you want me to be anymore. I can't pretend that billable hours matter more than justice. That career advancement is more important than doing the right thing. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we had never been able to say to each other. If you do this, he said finally, you're on your own. Don't expect the family to clean up the mess when this idealistic fantasy collapses. I understand. But I didn't. Not really. I didn't understand how completely they would cut me off, how thoroughly they would work to undermine everything I tried to build. I didn't understand that walking away from Morris & Hartwell was just the first step in a much longer journey that would eventually lead me to that federal courthouse, standing in a hallway while my own family had me removed from a murder trial. All I knew was that for the first time in years I felt like myself again, scared, uncertain, but finally awake. Walking away from Morris & Hartwell felt like stepping off a cliff, but landing felt like something else entirely. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to practice law the way I believed it should be practiced. The problem was, I had no idea where to start. Jessica's case gave me focus. I threw myself into criminal defense work with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. I rented a small office above a deli in Hartford's South End, a far cry from the marble lobbies and mahogany conference rooms I was used to, but the rent was cheap, and the location put me close to the courthouse and the communities I wanted to serve. My first challenge was learning the practical mechanics of criminal law. Corporate litigation had taught me research and analysis, but criminal defense required different skills. How to cross-examine police officers, how to challenge forensic evidence, how to read a jury's body language during opening statements. I reached out to Elena Rodriguez, a veteran public defender who had been practicing criminal law for 15 years. Elena had a reputation for being tough, brilliant, and completely unimpressed by credentials or connections. When I called her office, explaining that I was a former corporate attorney who wanted to learn criminal defense, I expected skepticism. What I got was something more valuable: honest assessment. You know, corporate law pays about 10 times what criminal defense pays, right? She asked during our first meeting in her cluttered office near the courthouse. Money isn't the issue. Family pressure, midlife crisis, sudden attack of conscience, something like that. Elena studied me for a long moment, then laughed. Well, at least you're honest. Most attorneys who come slumming in criminal law pretend they've always cared about justice. Tell me about your case. I laid out everything I knew about Jessica's situation, the timeline, the evidence, the witness testimony, the gaps in the investigation. Elena listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad that looked like it had survived several natural disasters. The witness concerns me, she said when I finished. Tommy Vasquez, you said he has priors, drug possession, minor theft charges, nothing violent, but enough to make his credibility questionable, or enough to make him useful to prosecutors who need someone to testify. You've looked into whether he had any relationship with the victim. I hadn't. That was the first lesson Elena taught me. In criminal defense, the most important questions weren't always the obvious ones. Over the next 2 weeks, she walked me through the investigation process, how to interview witnesses, how to challenge police procedures, how to build reasonable doubt from the gaps in the prosecution's narrative. What we discovered changed everything. Marcus Webb hadn't been a random victim. He had been working with federal investigators, providing information about drug trafficking in his neighborhood. The police reports mentioned this in passing, treating it as irrelevant background information, but Elena recognized what I had missed. Marcus wasn't just a teenager in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was an informant whose cooperation had put him in danger. This opens up a whole different pool of suspects. Elena explained as we reviewed the federal case files we had subpoenaed. Marcus was helping the feds build cases against some serious people with serious reasons to want him dead. But why hasn't the prosecution mentioned this? Because it complicates their narrative. It's easier to prosecute a social worker with circumstantial evidence than to investigate organized drug trafficking. Jessica's an easy target, educated, middle class, no criminal history. A jury will find her more relatable than the kind of people who actually kill informants. The more we dug, the more obvious it became that Jessica's prosecution was a convenience, not a pursuit of justice. The police had focused on her because she was accessible and cooperative, not because the evidence pointed in her direction. They hadn't seriously investigated Marcus's work as an informant, because that would have required coordination with federal agencies and resources they didn't want to commit. But Elena taught me something else crucial. Being right wasn't enough. We needed to prove our case systematically, piece by piece, in a way that would convince 12 jurors who probably wanted to go home to their families more than they wanted to unravel a conspiracy. We spent the next month building our defense strategy. Elena introduced me to private investigators who specialized in federal cases, forensic experts who could challenge the prosecution's physical evidence, and character witnesses who could testify to Jessica's commitment to helping kids like Marcus. The work was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. 16-hour days, researching case law, tracking down witnesses, preparing motions to suppress evidence that had been gathered improperly. I felt like I was using parts of my brain that had been dormant during my corporate years, solving puzzles that actually mattered. But as our defense took shape, so did the opposition we were facing. It became clear that forces beyond the prosecutor's office were invested in Jessica's conviction. The first sign came when our private investigator, Marcus Thompson, called me on a Friday evening, his usually calm voice tight with concern. "Sarah, I need to see you, now, not over the phone." We met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, far enough from my office to ensure privacy. Marcus slid a manila envelope across the table. "Someone's been asking questions about you," he said quietly. "About your background, your family connections, your reasons for taking this case." Inside the envelope were photographs, me entering Elena's office, me interviewing witnesses, me reviewing documents at the public library. Someone had been following me for weeks. Who's asking questions? Private security firm called Blackstone Investigations. High-end outfit that usually works for corporations and wealthy individuals. The kind of people who can afford sophisticated surveillance. My blood went cold. My family? That's my guess. The timing fits, the resources fit, and the questions they're asking suggest someone wants to know if you can be discouraged from continuing with this case. I stared at the photographs, recognizing the systematic thoroughness I had seen in my father's legal work. This wasn't random harassment. This was strategic intimidation. There's more, Marcus continued. I did some digging on Tommy Vasquez, your star witness. Turns out he's been getting financial assistance recently. Rent payments, car repairs, legal fees for an unrelated case. All coming from an account linked to a shell company. Someone's paying him to testify. Someone's making sure he's comfortable enough to stick to his story. It's not technically witness tampering, but it's close enough to make me nervous. That weekend, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of backing down, I decided to fight back with the same systematic approach my opponents were using against me. I called David Chen, a former federal prosecutor who had left the Department of Justice to start his own practice, specializing in government corruption cases. David had a reputation for taking on powerful interests and winning, but more importantly, he understood how to navigate the intersection of criminal law and federal oversight. You're dealing with more than just a murder case, David told me after reviewing our evidence. This looks like obstruction of a federal investigation. If someone killed Marcus to stop him from testifying, and if local authorities are covering it up, that's a civil rights violation under federal jurisdiction. Can you help us? I can do better than that. I can put you in touch with people who have the resources to investigate this properly. FBI agents who specialize in corruption cases, federal prosecutors who aren't afraid of stepping on local toes. Within a week, David had arranged meetings with federal investigators who confirmed our suspicions. Marcus Webb's murder was connected to the drug trafficking investigation he had been assisting with. His killing had been designed to send a message to other potential informants, and Jessica's prosecution was providing convenient cover for the real perpetrators. But the federal agents also confirmed something else. The level of coordination required to manipulate local law enforcement and silence potential witnesses suggested involvement by people with significant resources and political connections. We're not just dealing with street-level drug dealers, Agent Sarah Martinez explained during a confidential briefing in her downtown office. This goes higher. People with the influence to pressure prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys. People like my family. We can't comment on ongoing investigations, but we can tell you that you've attracted attention from individuals who have the means to make your life very difficult if you continue pursuing this case. That night, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by case files and legal briefs, trying to process the magnitude of what I had uncovered. Jessica's case had led me into a web of corruption that included drug trafficking, witness intimidation, prosecutorial misconduct, and possibly obstruction of federal investigations. My family hadn't just cut me off financially and professionally. They had actively worked to undermine my ability to practice law effectively. They had hired private investigators to follow me, identified pressure points to discourage my work, and possibly influenced the very case I was trying to defend. But I had also built something they hadn't anticipated. A network of allies who shared my commitment to justice over convenience. Elena Rodriguez, Marcus Thompson, David Chen, Agent Martinez. People who understood that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem impossible to win. I looked at the photographs of Jessica that Danny had given me. Pictures of her working with kids at the community center, laughing with Marcus at a basketball game, helping elderly residents navigate social services applications. She was sitting in a jail cell because she had dedicated her life to helping people who couldn't help themselves. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had spent years trying to teach me that idealism was a luxury, that practical considerations should always override moral principles. But their efforts to destroy Jessica's defense had shown me something they never intended, that the most practical thing you can do is fight for what's right, no matter how powerful the opposition might be. I reached for my phone and called Elena. It's Sarah. We need to expand our strategy. This case is bigger than we thought, and we're going to need federal support to win it. How much bigger? Big enough that my family is having me followed by private investigators. Elena was quiet for a moment. Sarah, are you sure you want to do this? Once we involve federal agencies, there's no going back. This becomes about more than just Jessica. I'm sure. Jessica deserves a real defense, not a show trial designed to cover up other people's crimes. All right then. Let's go to war. The morning of Jessica's trial, I arrived at the federal courthouse carrying 3 boxes of evidence and a subpoena that would change everything. 8 months of investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that reached far beyond a single Segel case. But I knew the real battle would be fought in that courtroom over the next few days. Judge Patricia Morrison. Yes, the same Morrison who had given my family such confidence in their connections, presided over what everyone expected to be a routine murder trial. She had no idea that federal agents were positioned throughout her courtroom, or that the prosecution's star witness was about to be exposed as part of a conspiracy that implicated some of the most powerful people in Connecticut's legal establishment. My family occupied the first 2 rows behind the prosecution table. My parents, Michael and his wife Rebecca, various aunts and uncles who had come to witness what they expected to be my professional humiliation. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions that mixed pity with satisfaction. My father had made several calls to colleagues over the past week, expressing his concern about my breakdown and assuring them that the family would handle my inevitable failure discreetly. He had no idea that Agent Martinez was recording those conversations as evidence of obstruction of justice. The prosecution's opening statement was exactly what we had expected. Jessica Morrison, troubled social worker with a history of emotional instability, had killed Marcus Webb in a moment of rage when her efforts to save him had failed. Simple narrative, tragic but understandable, designed to resonate with jurors who probably viewed inner-city violence as an unfortunate but predictable reality. When it was my turn to address the jury, I stood up slowly, letting the silence build until every person in that courtroom was focused on what I was about to say. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I began, my voice carrying the authority I had learned from years of corporate presentations, but powered by something deeper. What you are about to witness is not a murder trial. What you are about to witness is the exposure of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of our legal system, a conspiracy that requires the prosecution of an innocent woman to protect the guilty. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was immediately silenced by Judge Morrison's gavel, but I could see the shift in attention, the sudden awareness that this case was not going to unfold as anyone had expected. Over the next 3 days, Elena and I systematically dismantled the prosecution's case while building our own narrative of federal informants, drug trafficking, and institutional corruption. Tommy Vasquez, the prosecution's star witness, crumbled under cross-examination when confronted with financial records showing payments from the shell company Marcus Thompson had identified. "Mr. Vasquez," I said, approaching the witness stand with a manila folder, "you testified that you saw Jessica Morrison near the building where Marcus Webb was killed on the night of March 15th. Are you certain of that date?" "Yes, absolutely. And you're certain it was Jessica Morrison you saw?" "Positive. I know her from the neighborhood." I opened the folder and removed a photograph. "Mr. Vasquez, I'm showing you what has been marked as Defense Exhibit 47. Can you tell the jury what this is?" Tommy squinted at the photograph, his confidence beginning to waver. "I'm not sure. It's a photograph of Jessica Morrison at a conference in Boston on March 15th, taken at 8:30 p.m. The same time you claim to have seen her in Hartford. The photograph is time-stamped, and we have hotel records, airline tickets, and testimony from 12 conference attendees who can place her there." The prosecution objected, but the damage was done. Tommy's testimony fell apart under further questioning, especially when I introduced evidence of the payments he had received and his connection to the same drug trafficking network that Marcus Webb had been investigating. But the real bombshell came on the 3rd day, when David Chen entered the courtroom accompanied by FBI agent Martinez and carrying a federal warrant for the arrest of Detective Raymond Walsh, the lead investigator on Marcus Webb's case. "Your Honor," David announced, "we have evidence that Detective Walsh suppressed federal informant records, manipulated witness testimony, and conspired to obstruct a federal investigation." We also have evidence that this conspiracy involved individuals with direct connections to this court and to the defendant's prosecution. Judge Morrison's face went white. Mr. Chin, this is highly irregular. You cannot simply interrupt. Your Honor, we have probable cause to believe that this prosecution was initiated specifically to cover up the murder of a federal informant. We have recordings of conversations between Detective Walsh and individuals who directed him to focus the investigation on Ms. Morrison despite evidence pointing to other suspects. The courtroom erupted. Reporters who had been covering what they thought was a routine murder trial suddenly realized they were witnessing something much bigger. My family members looked around in confusion, beginning to understand that the dynamics of this trial were not what they had expected. But the real shock came when Agent Martinez approached my parents' row and spoke quietly to my father. Richard Brooks, FBI, we need you to come with us for questioning in connection with obstruction of a federal investigation. The color drained from my father's face. There must be some mistake. No mistake, sir. We have recordings of phone conversations between you and Detective Walsh discussing ways to undermine your daughter's defense of Ms. Morrison. We also have financial records showing payments from your law firm to private investigators who conducted illegal surveillance of federal witnesses. My mother's hand flew to her chest. Michael half stood from his seat, looking around wildly as if searching for an escape route. The whispered conversations in their row died completely, replaced by stunned silence. But I wasn't watching them. I was watching Judge Morrison, whose expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching terror as she realized that her own involvement in the case was about to be scrutinized by federal investigators. Your Honor, I said, standing to address the court, in light of these revelations, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. The prosecution's case was built on perjured testimony and suppressed evidence, all in service of a conspiracy to obstruct federal law enforcement. Motion granted, Judge Morrison said quickly, her voice barely audible. All charges against Jessica Morrison are hereby dismissed. The gavel came down, but the real drama was just beginning. As Jessica was released from custody and reunited with Danny, federal agents were escorting my father from the courtroom. Detective Walsh was already in handcuffs, and David Chen was explaining to reporters that the investigation into corruption in the local judicial system was just beginning. I stood in the center of it all, watching my family's carefully constructed world collapse around them. My mother was crying quietly, her perfect composure finally cracking. Michael was on his phone, probably calling lawyers. Rebecca looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. But my father, as Agent Martinez read him his rights, looked directly at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something closer to recognition. For the first time in my life, he was seeing me clearly, not as the daughter who didn't understand how the world worked, but as the adversary who understood it better than he did. You did this, he said as the agents led him past my table. You destroyed your own family. I met his eyes without flinching. I exposed the truth. If that destroyed anything, it's because what you built was built on lies. The irony was perfect and terrible. My family had spent years trying to teach me that success required compromise, that justice was less important than maintaining relationships and protecting reputations. They had tried to crush my idealism by showing me how powerless individual integrity was against institutional corruption. Instead, they had shown me exactly the opposite. They had shown me that corruption was vulnerable, that conspiracies depended on silence and complicity, and that sometimes one person willing to fight for the truth could bring down an entire network of powerful people who thought they were untouchable. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Elena put her hand on my shoulder. You know this is just the beginning, right? She said quietly. The federal investigation is going to expand. More arrests, more trials, more people whose careers and reputations are going to be destroyed. I know. Some of those people are going to be your family members. I know that too. Elena studied my face, looking for some sign of regret or uncertainty. Are you okay with that? I looked across the courtroom at Jessica, who was crying with relief as she hugged Danny. I thought about Marcus Webb, whose murder would finally be properly investigated. I thought about all the other cases that had been compromised by the same corruption we had just exposed. I'm more than okay with it, I said. I'm proud of it. But even as I said the words, I knew that winning this battle had cost me something I could never get back. The family that had rejected my idealism, that had tried to crush my commitment to justice, was gone forever. Not just because they would be facing federal prosecution, but because I had finally accepted what I had been fighting against for years. We had never really been on the same side. The war was over, and I had won. But victory felt different than I had expected. Cleaner, sharper, and infinitely more lonely than I had imagined it would be. The weeks following the trial felt like living in the eye of a hurricane. While the media storm raged around me and federal investigators continued unraveling the corruption network we had exposed, I found myself in a strange state of suspended animation, victorious, but hollow, vindicated but profoundly alone. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Within 48 hours of my father's arrest, the Connecticut legal community was in turmoil. 3 more judges were suspended pending investigation. 2 prosecutors resigned. The Hartford Police Department's entire narcotics division was placed under federal oversight. What had started as Jessica Morrison's murder trial had become the largest corruption scandal in the state's modern history. My phone rang constantly, reporters wanting statements, legal colleagues expressing shock, former classmates suddenly remembering our friendship. But the calls I had been expecting, the ones from my family, never came. The silence from Cedar Street was absolute and somehow more devastating than any angry confrontation would have been. I learned about my father's indictment from the morning news, sitting in my small apartment with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. Richard Brooks, along with Detective Walsh and 2 other members of what federal prosecutors were calling the Hartford Network, faced charges including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The potential sentences ranged from 15 to 25 years. Elena found me that morning, sitting on my couch still in yesterday's clothes, staring at the television coverage. "You haven't been answering your phone," she said, settling beside me without invitation. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About whether winning was worth it." Elena picked up the remote and turned off the television. "Talk to me." "My father's going to prison. My mother will probably lose the house when the legal bills pile up. Michael's reputation is destroyed by association. My entire family's life is unraveling, and I'm the one who pulled the thread. You exposed corruption that was destroying innocent lives. I know, intellectually, I know that what we did was right. Marcus Webb's real killers have been arrested. Jessica is free. The system that allowed this to happen is being reformed, but emotionally, I trailed off, unable to articulate the complexity of what I was feeling. Victory was supposed to feel triumphant, but this felt more like surviving a natural disaster. Grateful to be alive, but mourning everything that had been lost in the process. Elena was quiet for a long moment. "You want to know something? The first time I sent a corrupt cop to prison, I threw up in the courthouse bathroom afterward. Not because I regretted it, but because I realized that doing the right thing sometimes means accepting consequences you never wanted. How do you live with it? You remember why you did it. You focus on the people who are better off because you had the courage to act when others wouldn't." That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Danny knocked on my door carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "How's Jessica?" I asked, letting him into my living room. "Better than good, actually. She's talking about going back to work, helping other kids in the community. She wanted me to give you this." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Jessica and a photograph of her with a group of teenagers at the community center where she worked. "Sarah," the letter began, "I don't have words for what you've given me. Not just my freedom, but my life back, my ability to keep doing the work I love. But I also wanted you to know about something else your investigation uncovered." The letter went on to explain that the federal investigation had revealed that Marcus Webb wasn't the only young informant who had been targeted. 3 other teenagers had been killed over the past 2 years, their deaths covered up by the same network of corrupt officials. Jessica's case had not only cleared her name, but had exposed a pattern of violence that had been systematically hidden from federal oversight. The FBI told me that if you hadn't fought for my case the way you did, this would never have come to light. The letter continued. Those other families would never have known what really happened to their children. You didn't just save me, you gave them answers they thought they'd never get. I set the letter down and looked at the photograph. Jessica was smiling, surrounded by kids who looked exactly like Marcus Webb, young, hopeful, deserving of protection rather than exploitation. For the first time since the trial ended, I felt something other than loss. The federal investigation continued for months, revealing layers of corruption that extended far beyond what we had initially uncovered. Judge Morrison resigned in disgrace when it emerged that she had been taking bribes to influence sentencing in drug cases. Several attorneys at prominent firms, including Morrison, Hartwell and Associates, were disbarred for their roles in the conspiracy. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came 6 months after the trial, when Agent Martinez called me with news that changed everything I thought I understood about my family's involvement. "Sarah, we need to talk. There's something about your father's case that you need to know." We met at the same coffee shop where Marcus Thompson had first shown me the surveillance photographs. Agent Martinez looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from spending months investigating people you once respected. "Your father's cooperation has been unexpected," she began carefully. "Cooperation?" "He's been providing information about the network's operations, names, dates, financial records, recorded conversations. His testimony is going to be crucial in prosecuting the higher-level conspirators." I stared at her, not sure I had heard correctly. "My father is cooperating with federal prosecutors. More than cooperating. He's been instrumental in mapping out how the corruption network operated, who was involved, how decisions were made. Without his information, we never would have been able to trace the connections to organized crime figures who were ultimately behind Marcus Webb's murder." "Why?" Agent Martinez hesitated. "He said something that stuck with me. He said his daughter had shown him what integrity actually looked like, and he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life being the person she had exposed him to be." The conversation lasted 2 hours, during which I learned that my father's participation in the conspiracy had been more limited than we initially thought. He had been pressured into providing information about my investigation, but he hadn't been one of the architects of the cover-up. More importantly, his decision to cooperate fully with federal investigators was helping to dismantle corruption networks that extended into other states. "He's not going to escape consequences," Agent Martinez made clear, "but his sentence will likely be significantly reduced because of his cooperation. And more importantly, the information he's provided is going to prevent future cases like Marcus Webb's." That evening, I did something I hadn't done since the day of the trial. I drove to my childhood home. My mother answered the door looking older and smaller than I remembered. The house behind her seemed dimmer, less polished, as if the careful perfection had been drained away along with the family's reputation. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I wondered if you would come." We sat in the living room where I had spent so many uncomfortable dinners, but the atmosphere was different now. The portraits on the mantel seemed to be watching us with something like sadness rather than judgment. "I know you must hate us," my mother said, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I don't hate you, I'm angry, and I'm hurt, but I don't hate you. Your father's been in touch with his lawyers. He says the prosecutors think his cooperation might reduce his sentence to 3 to 5 years. Agent Martinez told me." My mother looked up, surprised. "You've been talking to the FBI?" "They thought I should know that he was helping with the investigation." Are you satisfied with that? With him going to prison?" It was a question I had been asking myself for months, and I still didn't have a complete answer. "I'm satisfied that the truth came out. I'm satisfied that the people who killed Marcus Webb are going to face justice. I'm satisfied that the corruption that destroyed so many lives is being exposed. Whether Dad goes to prison for 3 years or 20 years doesn't change any of that." My mother was quiet for a long moment. He's proud of you, you know. He won't say it directly, but he's proud that you had the courage to do what was right, even when it cost you everything. It didn't cost me everything. It cost me a version of my family that was built on lies and compromise. But maybe that's not the same thing. We talked for another hour, carefully navigating the wreckage of our relationship, trying to find some foundation that might support whatever came next. It wasn't forgiveness, the wounds were too deep for that, but it was something like understanding. As I drove home that night, I realized that the aftermath of victory is never simple. Winning doesn't erase the pain of what was lost, and justice doesn't automatically heal the relationships that were broken in pursuit of it. But it does something else, something that might be more important. It creates space for the possibility of something better to grow in place of what was destroyed. The person I had become through this process, the lawyer who chose integrity over convenience, who fought for justice even when it meant fighting against her own family. That person was someone I could respect, and for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. 3 years after Jessica Morrison walked free from that Hartford courthouse, I stood in a very different courtroom, the chambers of the United States Supreme Court, where Chief Justice William Harrison was administering the oath that would make me the youngest Chief Justice in American history. The path from exposing corruption in Connecticut to leading the nation's highest court had been unexpected, to say the least. But as I raised my right hand and repeated words that had been spoken by only 16 other people in our nation's history, I understood that every difficult choice, every burned bridge, every moment doubt, had led to this singular moment of purpose. The transformation had begun 18 months earlier, when President Elizabeth Warren announced her intention to nominate me to replace retiring Justice Samuel Reynolds. The legal community was stunned. I was only 44 years old, had never served as a federal judge, and my most prominent case had resulted in the imprisonment of my own father. But President Warren saw something different in my story. During our first meeting in the Oval Office, she explained her reasoning in terms that would have sounded familiar to anyone who knew about Jessica's case. "Sarah," she said, "the Supreme Court doesn't need another justice who understands how the system is supposed to work. It needs someone who understands how the system actually works and who has the courage to fix it when it breaks down." The confirmation hearings were brutal. Republican senators questioned my temperament, my experience, my judgment in destroying my own family for the sake of a single case. Democratic senators worried that my corporate law background would make me too conservative on business issues. Legal scholars debated whether someone who had practiced law for only 8 years could effectively lead an institution as complex as the Supreme Court. Senator James Richardson from Texas was particularly aggressive during the questioning, suggesting that my actions in the Morrison case demonstrated a dangerous willingness to prioritize personal beliefs over legal precedent. "Judge Brooks," he said, leaning forward with the kind of theatrical intensity that played well on cable news, "you sent your own father to federal prison. If you're willing to destroy your family in pursuit of what you consider justice, what's to stop you from destroying constitutional principles in service of your personal ideology?" I had prepared for this question for weeks, but when the moment came, I found myself responding not with the carefully crafted answer my confirmation team had developed, but with something more personal and immediate. "Senator Richardson," I began, "I didn't send my father to prison. His own choices did that. What I did was refuse to let corruption continue simply because it was convenient for people I loved. The Constitution isn't a document that protects the powerful from accountability. It's a document that protects the powerless from the abuse of power. If we can't apply those principles even when it costs us personally, then we don't really believe in them at all." The hearing room fell silent. For a moment, even the reporters stopped typing. "The law means nothing," I continued, "if it only applies to people who can't afford to escape it. Justice means nothing if it only protects people who don't need protection. And the Constitution means nothing if we're only willing to defend it when it's easy." The footage of that exchange played on every major news network for weeks. Constitutional law professors wrote articles analyzing my judicial philosophy. Editorial boards debated whether my approach represented dangerous activism or necessary accountability. But the response that mattered most came from an unexpected source. 3 days after my confirmation hearing, I received a letter postmarked from the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. "Sarah," my father wrote in handwriting that looked frailer than I remembered, "I watched your testimony on the news in the prison common room. For the first time in my life, I understood what you were trying to tell us all those years ago. You weren't being naive or idealistic. You were being principled in a way that I never had the courage to be. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to say that." The Senate confirmed my nomination by a vote of 67-33, with surprising support from moderate Republicans who had been impressed by my commitment to constitutional principles over partisan politics. Chief Justice Harrison, who was retiring after 15 years of distinguished service, personally called to congratulate me and offer his assistance during the transition. But the real work began after the ceremony, when I moved into the Chief Justice's chambers and began the process of leading a court that was deeply divided on issues ranging from voting rights to corporate power to environmental protection. My first major case as Chief Justice involved, fittingly, questions of prosecutorial misconduct and federal oversight of local law enforcement. The case, Rodriguez, State of Arizona, centered on whether federal courts could intervene when local prosecutors systematically failed to investigate crimes against minority communities. During oral arguments, I found myself thinking about Marcus Webb, about Jessica Morrison, about all the cases that never made it to federal court because local corruption prevented justice from even being pursued. The legal principles were complex, but the human stakes were achingly familiar. When I wrote the majority opinion in Rodriguez, establishing federal courts' authority to intervene in cases of systematic prosecutorial failure, I thought about Elena Rodriguez teaching me to see patterns in seemingly isolated injustices. When I crafted language protecting whistleblowers who exposed corruption in law enforcement, I thought about Agent Martinez and the courage it took to investigate powerful people. But the case that truly defined my early tenure as Chief Justice came 2 years later, when the court heard arguments in Brooks v. Connecticut Department of Corrections, a case challenging the conditions at the federal prison where my father was serving his sentence. The irony was almost overwhelming. A case bearing my family name, challenging the treatment of federal prisoners, argued before a court that I now led. Several justices suggested that I should recuse myself due to the obvious conflict of interest. Chief Justice Brooks, Justice Angela Martinez asked during our private conference, "How can you possibly be objective about prison conditions when your own father is incarcerated in the federal system?" It was a fair question, and one I had been wrestling with since the case was first appealed to our docket. "Justice Martinez," I replied, "I think the question isn't whether I can be objective, but whether my experience gives me insights that might be valuable to our deliberations. I've seen both sides of the criminal justice system now, as a prosecutor and as the daughter of someone who was prosecuted. Maybe that perspective is exactly what this case needs." The court voted 5-4 to allow me to participate in the case, and our eventual decision in Brooks v. Connecticut Department of Corrections established important precedents for the humane treatment of federal prisoners and the accountability of correctional institutions. But my father's reaction to the decision was more meaningful to me than any legal precedent. In his letter responding to the ruling, he wrote, "Sarah, you could have recused yourself and avoided any appearance of impropriety. The fact that you chose to participate and that you voted to improve conditions for all prisoners rather than just advocating for easier treatment shows me that you've become the kind of judge I always hoped to appear before. Someone who understands that justice isn't about helping people you care about, but about applying the law fairly to everyone." As I write this, 5 years into my tenure as Chief Justice, I'm often asked about the cost of the choices I made in Jessica Morrison's case. Reporters want to know if I regret destroying my family's reputation, if I wish I had found a way to pursue justice without such personal consequences. The honest answer is complicated. I miss the family. I thought I had, but I don't regret discovering who they really were. I grieve the relationships that were broken, but I'm grateful for the clarity that came from their destruction. I wish my father hadn't had to go to prison to understand the importance of integrity, but I'm proud that he ultimately chose cooperation over continued corruption. The Supreme Court building sits across from the Capitol, its marble columns rising toward the words "Equal Justice Under Law," carved into the stone above our entrance. Every morning as I walk up those steps, I think about the path that brought me here, the uncomfortable dinners where I asked unwelcome questions, the law school professors who tried to convince me that idealism was impractical, the family members who believed that loyalty mattered more than truth. But I also think about Jessica Morrison, who returned to her work at the community center and now runs programs that have helped hundreds of at-risk youth stay in school and out of the criminal justice system. I think about Marcus Webb's family, who finally got answers about what happened to their son. I think about the other families whose children were killed by the same corruption network. Families who can now begin to heal because the truth finally came to light. And I think about the young lawyers who write to me asking for advice about how to maintain their integrity in a legal system that often rewards compromise over courage. I tell them what Elena Rodriguez taught me, that the law is only as strong as the people who are willing to defend it, even when that defense comes at a personal cost. Last month, I spoke at Yale Law School's graduation ceremony. Looking out at 200 young faces filled with ambition and idealism, I remembered sitting in those same seats 20 years earlier, wondering if my commitment to justice would survive contact with the legal profession's practical realities. The law, I told them, is not a perfect system operated by perfect people. It's a flawed system operated by flawed people who are trying, imperfectly, to create something better than what existed before. Your job isn't to accept that system as it is, but to improve it through your choices, your courage, and your commitment to the principle that justice isn't just for people who can afford it. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me with a question that sounded familiar. "Chief Justice Brooks," she said, "my family wants me to join my father's corporate law firm, but I'm interested in civil rights work. They keep telling me I'm being naive, that I need to be practical about my career. How do you know when the principle is worth the cost?" I looked at her, young, earnest, facing the same choice I had faced decades earlier, and I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. "You don't know," I told her honestly. "You can't calculate the cost of integrity in advance, and you can't predict where principled choices will lead you. But I can tell you this. The cost of compromising your principles is always higher than it appears, and the benefits of standing up for what's right are always more lasting than you expect." She nodded, thanked me, and walked away toward whatever choice would define her own path toward justice. As I watched her go, I realized that this is how change really happens. Not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through individual choices made by people who believe that the law can be something more than just a tool for the powerful to maintain their power. My name is Sarah Catherine Brooks. I am the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. But more importantly, I am someone who learned that the most practical thing you can do is fight for what's right, no matter who tries to stop you. And that lesson, more than any legal precedent or constitutional interpretation, is the legacy I hope to leave for the next generation of lawyers who believe that justice is worth pursuing, even when it costs everything you thought you wanted. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.